Good morning, students. In today's lecture, we would be talking about the remaining portion related with the anatomy of the fourth ventricle. In the previous lecture, we had discussed about the lateral boundaries of the ventricle and also about the floor of the ventricle. We had talked about some important structures related with the floor. Now, in today's lecture, we would talk about the roof of the fourth ventricle, about some important recesses and angles related with the fourth ventricle, and also about a few points about the clinical significance of the fourth ventricle. In this figure, this is the portion of the hindbrain. This is the cerebellum, pons, and medulla. And in between this tent-shaped cavity is the fourth ventricle. So the roof of the fourth ventricle is a diamond-shaped structure for the purpose of study, divisible into two parts, the superior or cranial part and the inferior or the caudal part. So this is the superior or the cranial portion and this is the inferior or the caudal portion of the roof of the fourth ventricle. So the superior or the cranial part is formed by the superior cerebellar peduncles and by the superior medullary vellum. So the superior cerebellar peduncles, they emerge from the central white matter of the cerebellum. The peduncles, they emerge from the central white matter of the cerebellum. They pass cranially, ventrally and form the lateral boundaries of the fourth ventricle. And on approaching the inferior colliculi, these two swellings that you see here, these are the superior colliculi and these are the inferior colliculi on the midbrain. So as the superior peduncles reach the inferior colliculi, they converge and intermingle with each other and they form part of the roof of the fourth ventricle. Second structure is the superior medullary vellum. This is a lamina or a membrane, a layer, a thin lamina, transparent lamina of white matter made of nervous tissue, and it fills the interval between the superior cerebellar peduncles. So the vellum, the superior medullary vellum, it fills this angular interval between the two superior cerebellar peduncles. On the dorsal surface, this medullary vellum is covered by the lingula of the superior vermis. So lingula of superior vermis is one of the portions of the cerebellum. Next is the caudal or the inferior part of the roof. And you can see here, this is the caudal portion, inferior portion. It is formed by an extremely thin sheet of which is entirely devoid of nervous tissue. And it is formed by ventricular ependyma, and then there is a double fold of pia mater which is known as tela choroidi. So tela is basically, it means a web-like membrane. It adheres to the underlying ependyma and it gives rise to choroid plexus. So choroid plexus is a network, and choroid plexus is a network of cells which is responsible for production and secretion of cerebrospinal fluid in the ventricles of brain, and they also contain certain modified ependymal cells. So in the figure you can see the double layer of pia mater giving rise to this choroid plexus. So this is the caudal inferior part. And one more structure which contributes in the formation of the caudal part is the inferior medullary vellum. Again, it is also a thin layer, lamina of white substance. It is an extension of the white center of the cerebellum, and it forms the infero-posterior part of the roof of the fourth ventricle. So in the figure here you can see the superior portion formed by superior medullary vellum, the inferior portion formed by the inferior medullary vellum. In the roof there are two openings. One opening is the foramen of Magendie, which is in the midline. It is the median aperture. It communicates the ventricular system with the subarachnoid space. Another is the foramen of Luschka, which are the two lateral apertures. They are located at the ends of the lateral recess. You can see here in the figure. In the midline, this is the median aperture, which is the foramen of Magendie, and lateral recess, the ends of the lateral recess contains the foramen of Luschka, the lateral apertures. They also occupy parts of the choroid plexus. So the median aperture, you can see in this figure, this in green here is the foramen of Magendie, the median aperture, which communicates the ventricular system with the subarachnoid space. This is the communication. And in this figure, this green dot is the foramen of Luschka. This is half of the portion. The other half also contains the similar aperture, so they are two in number, and they also communicate the ventricular system to the subarachnoid space. The angles of the fourth ventricle, there are three angles, four actually. One is the superior angle. You can see here in this figure. On the superior side, the superior angle is continuous with the cerebral aqueduct. Inferior angle is continuous with the central canal, and there are two lateral angles on each side which are continuous with the inferior cerebellar peduncles. There are certain recesses related with the fourth ventricle. Recesses are empty spaces, and these spaces are extensions of the main cavity of the ventricle. So this is the main cavity, and this main cavity has extensions which are referred as the recesses. So one is the lateral recess, which is also labeled here. You can see on both sides is the lateral recess. It passes laterally in the interval between the inferior cerebellar peduncle and the peduncle of the flocculus. Peduncle of flocculus is another, it is a structure which is associated with the cerebellum. Then after the lateral recess, there is a median dorsal recess in the midline. And this is one, and it extends dorsally into the white core of the cerebellum. On each side of the dorsomedian recess, there are two recesses named as the dorsolateral recess or lateral dorsal recesses. So that is what is given here in the table, the three recesses and their location and their relation with the parts of the cerebellum. So you can see this is the median dorsal recess, and it extends into the white core of the cerebellum. Also, this is the figure which tries to explain the different recesses of the ventricle. So if this is the main cavity, these are the extensions of the main cavity. The lateral recesses, the dorsolateral recesses, and the dorsomedian recess. Lastly, the clinical importance of the fourth ventricle. So, when we had studied about the floor of the fourth ventricle, we had talked about the vagal triangle. Vagal triangle is significant because it contains, below it, there is the nucleus of the vagus nerve. Vagus nerve controls vital functions of the body. It controls digestion, respiration, cardiac functions. So, any injury in this area of the vagal triangle would affect the vital centers, would impact the vital functions of the body, and it can also prove fatal. Another clinical condition is presence of brain tumors in the infratentorial region, that is below the tentorium cerebelli. These tumors can block the foramen of Luschka and the Magendie, and because these foramens they uh, communicate the ventricular cavity with the subarachnoid space, so they maintain a static balance of intracranial pressure. So if there is any blockage, this would give rise to increased intracranial pressure, leading to symptoms such as headache, vomiting, nausea, and a condition papilloedema. Papilloedema is basically it's a condition where the optic nerve is affected. There's compression, swelling of the optic nerve, which would again lead to headache, nausea, visual disturbances, vomiting. So that's all about the anatomy of the fourth ventricle. Thank you so much.